So some of you know that I enjoy looking at my interfaith calendar, figuring out what we might focus on. And I'll give you a heads up that next week we're going to explore a little bit about Islam. And in the month of November, we're going to learn a lot about Native American traditions. And of course, in December, we have light to celebrate in so many different ways. And today we're doing something interesting, which is to look at the metaphysical Christian origins of this teaching. Did anybody read the newsletter, the little opening paragraph there? Well, I'll tell you what pretty much what that says. Many of you know already because I've shared it before. I'm the daughter of parents who left mainstream. They left the Methodist Church in the late 50s, and I was born in the early 60s, and they had at that time become Unitarian Universalists. Unitarians believe that we're all one. Universalists believe that revelation, spiritual revelation, is available equally to all. And at some point, those two factions became one. Not all of them. There are some Universalists who continue. They have I've met the dean of the seminary that teaches just Universalism. They're Gnostics. Very interesting. So anyway, I come to you from that pathway. I come to you as someone who was not exposed to a regular biblically based teaching. And throughout my own life, I developed a hunger for a type of spirituality that was more specific, tangible, that I could get my hands on and do something with in my life. And I ended up in this teaching. I've never left behind these ideas that we're all one. I've never left behind this idea that revelation is available equally to all. I've simply added something else to it that fits perfectly, which is this idea that it is done unto us as we believe. And that is something that comes from a very interesting place. It is a Christian root. So a brief primer on the history of that is that there's something called the New Thought movement. At the turn of the last century, can you believe that we're saying that now? At the turn of the last century, there was this wonderful group of people and this wonderful movement that was all about interpreting ancient wisdom, ancient teachings in a new way. In a way that hadn't been done before. And by the way, in a way that the basic tenets of freedom in this country allowed, permitted openly, perhaps for the first time, at least in a long while. So here's this group of people saying, I want to interpret this for myself. I want to look for an older version of it and interpret it for myself some more. I want to sit around and talk together about what we think it might mean rather than being told what it means. And in addition to that, they're doing all kinds of interesting things, not all of which we do here, by the way, but there was a lot of experimentation at that time. Just really exploring who are we and what does it all mean. So this New Thought movement gave rise to many things. And one of those is this concept of mental healing. There were many in the beginning who healed themselves, and that's how they came to be teachers. And they had diseases and conditions of some sort that the doctors were saying they couldn't help them with. And they experimented with these ideas of mental healing, of knowing something, knowing perfection despite appearances. They healed themselves, and then they became teachers. And then people studied with them. And they went off and started various movements that were in some way an extension of those ideas, an embodiment of them, a set of practices that included them. And some of those people include Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, who started the Unity Metaphysical Christian Church. We'll call the Unity Church of Christianity, right? Yeah. And Divine Science. Does anybody remember the name of the founder of Divine Science? I could have looked it up. Okay, we'll remember that. There's also Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Science. That is the most adherent to the letter of the metaphysical meaning behind biblical passages and the capacity for healing and transformation in each of those. Extraordinary reference called, let's see, Mary Baker Eddy, Science and Health, Guide, something to the Scriptures. Yeah. So there are plenty of places that you can go and really swim in that and play with that. The other teachings include this one right here, which was originally known as religious science and formed originally as an institute for the teaching and practice thereof. It wasn't a church. And then the name, the science of mind and spirit, evolved through the literature, and then it was shortened to the science of mind. So there's your history lesson about who we are. So the common Christian root in all of those would be any and every biblical passage that says, in essence, it is done unto you as you believe. And I have a couple of them here. I forgot to mention Emily Cady, who's considered the teacher of teachers. She was one of those, through her own healing and her own process, became a magnificent and prolific teacher. And another fun name, if you take a class with us, you'll learn this one too, Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. He was the man who coined the term mental healing, the concept. Okay, so I have a few quotes here, and you won't normally see me reading these sort of things. Mark 11:24. Therefore I say to you, anything you pray for and ask, believe that you will receive it, and it will be done for you. Matthew 21:21. Now, some of you know what this is in regard to. It has to do with a fig tree. Jesus was walking along the road. He was hungry. He stopped by a fig tree. It didn't have any fruit on it, and I don't know why. He said, "You'll never bear fruit again," and it withered. Okay, so his disciples are saying, "That was cool. How'd you do it?" Jesus answered, saying to them, truly, I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will perform a deed not only like this of the fig tree, but should you say even to this mountain, be removed and fall into the sea, it shall be done. And Matthew 21:22. And everything that you will ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. So, well, it turns out that Ernest Holmes, who was the founder of this teaching, was among those who really took that to heart and said, if that is so, then let's prove it for ourselves. Let's understand it more deeply. Let's practice it more deeply. If this guy said, all these things and more, so shall ye do, well, let's get started. And so that's what people were doing at that time. And it was an extraordinary time. So what comes out of that then is this idea that believing, that actually praying, believing, is not just something that one person did. It is something that someone did and said, you can do this too. There are books in which I've read phrases like, do not put on robes and worship me. And of course I promptly forgot which book that was, and I guess it doesn't matter. The idea is that something was taught that we have an opportunity to practice ourselves. Now, there's an interesting thing. You know, when we come up with a new idea and we do something new, perhaps at home in our family unit, perhaps in our group of friends, perhaps you remember coming up with a new idea or doing something new in the schoolyard. How did that go? How about in your workplace? It's not always openly and warmly accepted. There's this funny thing about new ideas and new deeds, new actions, change. I decided that perhaps there are two things that happen when those occur. One is that they're celebrated and embraced, and a new policy is created. From now on, let's always do that. Or perhaps they are rejected and vilified, and so a law or a rule is created that says from now on, we will never do that. There's some human tendency to try to label everything and put it in a box and get it to hold still again so we can go back to everything being predictable. And of course, that's not how life really works. Well, and this is very lighthearted. And yes, I'm attempting to be lighthearted about the past 2013 almost years. So there were new ideas that were shared, and there were new things done. And they amazed and inspired a few and frightened many. And what ensued is everything that we know about our history from that point until this. But it's possible that instead of accepting this idea that like if you like to watch documentaries and movies from the History Channel and so forth, you might start thinking, I don't know, are we ever going to stop doing this? The truth is that we have the capacity to do otherwise. And it begins by our being willing to imagine and even to believe in this thing not yet seen, which is this harmony, outpicturing as peace amongst us. Now there's something not yet seen to believe in. So the very principle that ticked everybody off happens to be the one that can free us and reharmonize all of us. There's another concept too, which is forgiveness. Can we look back? Whether we learn by experience, by watching documentaries, reading books, deep research, or meditation, I don't know. But if by some means we got this idea that all of this has been in error, we could say, wait a minute. There's something else that this master, and this is the one of that age, not the one and only the one of that age, said, forgive them their sins. They know not what they do. Can we do that? Because if we're all ticked off and thinking that we're all pretty much done for, so why bother, and let's just live a life of mediocrity until we're gone. If we do that, what good are we? We're still here, eyes and ears, and some of us wear glasses and hearing aids, some of us use something to help us walk, okay, so we use chiropractors, whatever. We're still here. And that truth is still here. And we're in a place where we're free to explore it and experiment with it, practice it, and get results with it, and be a positive influence in this world, beginning with our own lives and not limited to that. So we have an opportunity to look at what's happened with all of that and have a fresh idea about it, which might possibly influence what we do next. So yes, new ideas and new applications have a way of stirring things up, and that's just human nature, so we'll forgive that. We go back to this other idea about these teachings. Now, as you may know, because many of you are coming, we're doing a workshop this afternoon, so I decided not to add to what I was carrying around this morning. But I have something called the George Lambsa Bible, which is, of course, about that big. And it is a translation from the ancient Aramaic. That and the King James Bible, which is from the Greek, are supposedly the two most accurate references available at this time. I want to share a little something else with you before we look at this idea of exploring those teachings and considering the possibility of putting them into practice in a new way in our lives? Has anybody heard of Dr. David Hawkins in a book called Power versus Force? Okay. Well, he used applied kinesiology in his practice and was a doctor of psychology, I believe. I believe that's the case. In any case, he had a great fascination with all of this. And one of the many things that he did was to create this calibration scale of consciousness. And if you imagine with me that the top, enlightenment, absolute oneness, bliss, nirvana is 1,000. And then something below any life at all is 0. And everyone and everything in between falls somewhere on that scale. Okay? So what he said was that the original teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, of Yeshua ben Joseph, calibrated at 1,000. Possibly, according to him, the highest level of consciousness attainable on this plane. And then the teachings up until about, I think it was 200 AD or so, ranked still at about 980 or something. I'm getting the numbers a little accurate. And what happened is that there was this sort of steady decline each time a new emperor came into power. He said, in this section of the book, he says, if you want to calibrate, if you're a religious historian or student of that history, calibrate what the teaching resonated at the time of Paul, and at the time of Constantine, and at the time of Augustine, and just keep looking at that. Of course, one of the things that he pointed out was that at 325 AD, there was a big drop after the Council of Nicaea. The reason that I mention that is because, to the degree that we misunderstand new information and deeds we have not witnessed before, we go do funny things. So what happened was, well-meaning, I'm sure, the retranslations and the distillations and the changes that were made, for whatever reasons those were, increased a misunderstanding and increased a misinterpretation of both the words and some of those deeds. And they became something they weren't intended to be. So what we see floating around being offered most places nowadays is far from that thing. Many of us have walked away. Now, like I said, my parents walked away, so I didn't walk away from it. I started to walk towards it a little bit cautiously. I had lots of friends with lots of prejudices who were parroting the prejudices of their parents about all of this. And then I started to think for myself. And that's when I had the opportunity to begin to learn that what we're rejecting isn't the whole package. It's about half of it these days. The other thing is that whether it's Christianity or any other religion, when we get to the place of fundamentalism and militant activity in response to those beliefs or on behalf of them, that registers about 125 out of 1,000 in consciousness. And if you go home and pick up that book or get it at the library, I know there are used copies floating around all over the place. It's very fascinating. Because with each level of consciousness, there's a self-view, there is a God view, and there's a world view which corresponds to it. And there are emotional states, and there are typical ways of being which also correspond to it. So, if anybody is feeling like this idea of coming to a Sunday celebration and taking a class and reading another book is just frivolous, it's not. there is an opportunity because we have our eyes to see and ears to hear, and we have the freedom to do it, and I think we've got the time and even the inclination. There is an opportunity to delve, explore, interpret, practice for ourselves, support one another in it, and still bring the fruits of this whole thing to bear. I think that's a fantastic opportunity, and even in some ways, perhaps a holy responsibility. It's definitely an opportunity. So despite all that has happened in the name of someone and something misunderstood and misinterpreted, there's this thing about truth. It is changeless. It can neither be taken from nor added to. It can never be destroyed. It can never be muddied. It can be obscured. We're free to create that smog, if you will, but it can't go away. So if perhaps, like so many other master teachers throughout the history of all time, what was taught by this one over 2,000 years ago, if there is truth in that, and if he said all of these things and more, so shall ye do, then why not explore that? Why not consider that? Why not give that a try? If you look on the back table, you will see there's a list. It says what we believe. And those are some very bold statements about this teaching. We believe in the healing of the sick through the operation of this mind. There are 12 of them over there, and yes, I don't remember them. I don't have them memorized. So that is something really to consider, to pick up and have a look at. What we do here with all of this stuff about quantum physics and talking about believing and seeing, what we do here in our classes and in our groups, our Sunday celebrations, and in between in our conversations with one another, is to practice this idea that it is done unto us as we believe, and to be bold enough to try that and see what happens. And there is a temptation to go back to the familiar. There is a temptation to go back asleep. And yet Rumi says, don't go back to sleep. Remember that? Don't go back to sleep. There's another thing that Rumi also said. He said, out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. Meet me there. I believe that's where we're meeting. I believe that that's what we're doing. We have such a powerful opportunity to be among those who know and see that something greater has always been going on, and it is now. And it's not necessary to be pulled back down into the muck and the mire, but to be part of that consciousness that lifts us all out of it. Again, if you pick up this book a few pages past the section that I'm talking about, it delineates that those of us, for example, with the typical consciousness that we develop as students of the science of mind and spirit, like Ernest Holmes, have the capacity to change so many lives just by knowing the truth for ourselves. And as people move in the direction of mastery in greater and greater and greater degrees, they lift up more of those who don't know until there aren't any left who don't know. So perhaps what we're really participating in right now is that atonement. Perhaps what we're participating in right now is that rebirth. Ernest Holmes, and I will close with this, says there is a power for good in the universe, and you can use it. I'm in. Are you in? And so it is.